Hi, everyone. We'll give it a couple of moments as folks get joined on after this meeting has just opened. Good morning, everyone. Looks like folks are still trickling in. We'll give it a couple, maybe about a minute or so. Looks like we're starting to level off on our participants here, so I'll get us started. Good morning, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us this morning for the Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety's public workshop on the development of the 2025 Wildfire Mitigation Plan Update Guidelines. I'm Nathan Poon, an analyst in Energy Safety's Electric Safety Policy Division. With me today are Lucy Morgans, Program Manager of the Electric Safety Policy Division, and Colin Lang, Acting Program and Project Supervisor in the Electric Safety Policy Division. I'll get us started with a brief safety message. As this is a virtual workshop and everybody is participating remotely, please be aware of your surroundings and know the evacuation routes out of your location, especially if you are in a space which you use infrequently. Please be sure to have your emergency contact information readily available. And if you're alone in your space, please make sure that somebody is aware of your location in the event of an emergency. Finally, it is going to be a warm day in California today. Much of the state is in or will be soon under excessive heat watch or warning. Make sure you're staying hydrated and stay indoors, especially during the hottest part of the day. Be mindful of heat-related illnesses, especially in young children, the elderly, and your pets. Before we get started, please be aware that today's workshop is being recorded and will be posted on Energy Safety's webpage. I'll now turn it over to Lucy to get us started.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks very much for joining us today to talk about the important matter of the 2025 Wildfire Mitigation Plan Update Guidelines. So thanks to Nathan for the introduction and safety message. So I'm going to move on and provide an overview of the purpose, background, and context. For these update guidelines, I'll then talk about the objectives. And then I'll hand over to Colin, who's going to talk through our initial proposals. And I hope you've all managed to have a look at the initial proposals we circulated in advance of this workshop. It was attached to the workshop notice, and it included 4 initial proposals for what the electrical corporations could include within their WMP update. And we're hoping to talk about these 4 proposals in a bit more detail. So Colin's going to run through those and then finish up with the submission, a proposal for the submission schedule. Then we're going to have time to discuss these proposals and take Q&A. So we're going to be going through each one in turn and talking about what feedback stakeholders have, any questions, matters for clarification. I do want to say, to sort of level set, we've put out our initial proposals. We don't have our subject matter experts on the line. And the purpose of today, which I'll go through in a little bit, is really to take feedback from stakeholders in terms of what your initial views are, and whether you have any particular points that you require clarification on, and any other further matters you'd like to raise. And then we'll finish the workshop at around 12:30 with the next steps and close out. So next slide, thank you, Colin. So the purpose of today's workshop. So firstly, it's to provide context and background on the development of the 2025 WMP update guidelines. Secondly, as I mentioned earlier, it's to discuss our objectives for the 2025 WMP update guidelines. Thirdly, we want to provide an opportunity for stakeholder feedback early on in the development of these guidelines so that we can take your feedback and consider it and build it in to our development of guidelines where appropriate. We also want to identify any issues that we need to consider further. And then lastly, we want to provide you all with the next steps and take feedback on the submission schedule. So a brief background, Public Utilities Code section 8386B states that we may allow the annual submission to be updates to the last approved comprehensive wildfire mitigation plan, provided that each electrical corporation shall submit a comprehensive wildfire mitigation plan at least once every 3 years. So essentially what the legislation is saying there is that you'll have the electrical corporations will submit a comprehensive base plan once every 3 years, and in between those once every 3-year base plans, it's acceptable for the electrical corporations to submit updates to those base plans. And so what we're really focusing on here are the update guidelines. Next slide, please. And I think it's also useful to take a moment to properly understand where we are in the WMP cycle, because there have been a lot of changes and we are moving to a new approach. And the first year is this year. So in 2023, Energy Safety is evaluating and approving or denying the electrical corporation's comprehensive or base 2023 to 2025 wildfire mitigation plans. Next year, in 2024, electrical corporations will be submitting a 2025 wildfire mitigation plan that is an update to their 2023 to 2025 base plan that was submitted this year. And then henceforth, WMPs will be submitted and approved or denied before the plan year begins. So it can get very confusing, but hopefully we'll all get used to it. So this year, we are developing the 2025 WMP update guidelines that will be submitted next year in 2024 by the Electrical Corporation. So an overview of the objectives for the 2025 WMP update guidelines. So first of all, we want to meet that statutory requirement that I just read out in PUC 8386C. We want to focus on significant updates between 2023, between the 2023 to 2025 base WMP and the 2025 WMP update. And I think this point here is really critical and maybe a slight departure from what we've done before. Previously, the WMP submissions have it's been hard to distinguish between what's an update year and what's a base plan year. And I think this is the first year we really want to be making a difference in terms of the base WMP and then the updates that should only include those significant updates from the base year. We want to enable each electrical corporation to provide new and updated information regarding its WMP in a streamlined way. And we want to allow Energy Safety and other stakeholders to evaluate any significant updates and provide direction to the electrical corporation's mid-WMP cycle. So it's about striking a fine balance, having enough information so that we can understand what those significant updates are, but ensuring we have that distinction between the base plan and an update plan. So this isn't the first year that we have provided preliminary ideas for the 2025 WMP update guidelines. We first presented some initial ideas back in April 2022 when we were discussing and exploring the proposals for the base plan guidelines. Based on a lot of feedback that we had from stakeholders, we included the following text within section 13 of the WMP process and evaluation guidelines. We stated that Energy Safety will issue separate guidelines for WMP updates. The anticipated allowable revisions for WMP updates may include progress on areas for continued improvements, updates resulting from approved change order requests, mid-year and end-of-year targets for the year covered in the WMP update, updates based on lessons learned during the previous year, and finally, updates based on significant changes to risk models. And you'll see that some of the initial proposals that we circulated in advance of this workshop build on some of the ideas that are set out here. However, there are also some sort of important differences that we'll be discussing later on. So I'm now going to hand it over to Colin Lang, who's going to talk through the initial proposals that were circulated a couple of weeks ago with the workshop notice. And he's going to go through all of the proposals and finish up with the submission schedule. And then after that, we'll be taking questions and answers and having a period for discussion. Thank you very much. Over to you, Colin.
Thank you, Lucy. We'll start out with our proposed structure for the 2025 WMP update. First and probably foremost is the 2025 WMP update itself. It will be a standalone document that describes the proposed updates to the base year 2023 to 2025 wildfire mitigation plan, in accordance, and all, of course, written in accordance with the 25 update guidelines that we are developing. Second will be a redlined version of the 2023 to 2025 WMP, that base year plan, with the proposed updates described in the update included as part of the base year plan. So everything is in one place to have a full record of the plan and how it has been updated. And third is a clean version of the 2023 to 2025 WMP with all of those proposed updates included. Briefly, currently for the submission schedule, we are proposing that the electrical corporations who intend on requesting a safety certification would submit their 2025 updates in April of 2024, with those electric corporations who are not requesting a safety certificate to follow in June of 2024. We did have a pre-submission process to ensure completeness for these base year plans, and we propose a similar process for the 2025 updates. So these, you may have all seen these before with the workshop notice, but these are our initial proposals for reportable updates in the 2025 WMP update. They are put into 4 buckets. Firstly, proposed changes to the risk model that would significantly alter the top 20% risk profile and subsequently likely the work plan. Number 2, shifts in strategic direction from lessons learned, and that is lessons learned as defined by section 10 of the base year technical guidelines. Number 3 is progress on areas for continued improvement, those areas of continued improvement that come through energy safety's decisions on wildfire mitigation plans. And lastly, any updates to forecasted targets, performance metrics, and expenditure for 2025. So we'll go through each one of these in turn and discuss them a little bit more. First one, and probably the meatiest one, is the proposed changes to the risk model and the work plan. A little bit of history. Lucy mentioned that we had a workshop on the 2025 updates back in April of 2022. At the time, Energy Safety proposed that we freeze the risk models over the 3-year WMP cycle, but allow some changes in inputs and rerunning of the existing model, all in an effort to try to avoid larger changes in the plan. We got some excellent stakeholder feedback. Here's just like a sampling from Southern California Edison, A freeze could impede a utility's ability to make appropriate and timely changes in its risk model. Fair and reasonable, and this sentiment was echoed by the other utilities as well. Cal Advocates had a little bit of the opposite view, saying that freezing the models could promote continuity in the utility's selection and prioritization of mitigation efforts, and also allow interveners to conduct a more thorough analysis of the utility's mitigation efforts. So this was last year's proposal. And so we have now modified that proposal. And our objective here is to provide a process by which electrical corporations can report on continued refinement of both the planning and operational risk models in their 2025 WMP update. We have attempted to categorize these the collective refinements and updates to risk models as either significant or non-significant. They cannot be both. I apologize. I'm going to read this almost verbatim because it is a little bit complicated, but I will do some more explaining in the following slides. A significant update to the risk model is an update, any change or combination of changes to the risk model that moves 10% or more of the ignition risk and or PSPS risk in and out of the top 20% of highest risk circuits, segments, or spans. However, the electrical corporation presented their risk rankings in their base WMP. When all circuits, segments, or spans are ranked individually from highest to lowest. This definition attempts to exclude shifts in risk resulting from implementation of mitigation measures since the filing of the base WMP, allowing for apples to apples. For instance, and I'll explain this again in a moment, but the purpose of this to say if a circuit in a top, let's say 5% area was undergrounded, ideally, if that had been undergrounded in 2023, that circuit would drop off the top 20% risk because it is now undergrounded and most of that risk has been mitigated. Ideally, the implementation of that mitigation, in this case undergrounding, would not be taken into account for this analysis, and so we can compare year over year what those refinements do to the risk rankings of these circuits, segments, or spans. If the updates are significant, the electrical corporation must discuss its updated methodology, provide justification for these updates, and show how risk has shifted as a result of these updates. It must also report on any resulting changes to prioritization of the mitigation initiatives and any changes to scheduling or work plans. And ideally, we have proposed to limit this entire significant discussion to 15 pages. On the flip side, there may be some electrical corporations that meet the non-significant definition. Non-significant is any updates or changes or combination of changes to the risk model that moves less than 10% of ignition risk or PSPS risk in and out of the top 20% of highest risk circuits, segments, or spans when ranked from highest to lowest. If updates are non-significant, the electrical corporation still must provide a summary of the changes and refinements to its risk model, but this discussion would be limited to 3 pages. So we want to hear about the non-significant changes and the significant changes, but we want more detail if the changes meet the significant definition. Okay, I'm gonna show to the best of my ability how this will manifest. So this table represents an example of the top 20% risk circuits by rank. So you can see the top for this imaginary electrical corporation that includes 15 circuits ranked from 1 to 15. And they are ranked by their overall utility risk, which you can see is ignition risk plus PS risk equals overall utility risk. So they are ranked using overall utility risk. Let's say there are changes or a combination of changes that move, this is an egregious example, that move MODOC, the circuit MODOC, with 12% of the total ignition risk in the top 20% out of the top 20%, that would be a significant change because it is greater than a 10% change. Similarly, if a combination of changes, say Plumas and Calusa at 5% each, that makes 10%, which would trigger that significant definition. Similarly, if changes were made to the PSPS risk modeling, and that bumped the Sierra circuit with 14% out of the top 20, bumped this percentage out of the top 20%, that would also be a significant change. But say it was just like Siskiyou at 3%, that was bumped out, that is not significant. And we can answer questions about this later, and we can come back to this slide. Oh, and I should mention that any sort of movement in here is not considered significant. So if what's a good one? If like Plumas and Calusa at more than 10% moved from 11 and 12, like up to 1 and 2, that's not a significant change as it is movement within the top 20%. Okay, our next bucket of reportable updates is shifts in strategic direction from lessons learned. The objective of this bucket is to provide a process by which electrical corporations can propose key strategic changes mid-cycle that are not directly related to changes in risk modeling. Each update that the electrical corporation proposes must be tied to a key lesson learned. The electrical corporation would report the update and the lessons learned in a similar way that it did in section 10 of its 2023-2025 WMP. And these must be considered, these updates must meet the significant definition. And for the lessons learned significant definition, energy safety defines that as 1, changes to a 2025 target that was initially reported in the base WMP of greater than equal to 10%. Changes to the forecasted completion of initiative objective or target to a future compliance year. For example, if you had intended on completing a target or an objective in 2025, but that date moves to 2026, that is considered significant. A change in expenditure for an initiative activity of greater than equal to 10%, or creation of a new initiative activity or deletion of an existing initiative activity. For instance, if an electrical corporation had put a certain inspection program in their base WMP and decided through a lessons learned to no longer perform that inspection program, that would be considered a significant update based on lessons learned. Our third area is progress on areas for continued improvement. This provides a process by which electrical corporations can provide required updates on progress to address areas for continued improvement identified in the pending 2023 WMP evaluations and decisions. Electrical corporations must report on progress associated with areas of continued improvement where requested in previous WMP decisions. This format would be extremely similar to the current Appendix D of the 2023 to 2025 WMP technical guidelines. Energy safety will denote areas of continued improvement with required reporting in 2025 updates and in the base year decisions. So not all areas for continued improvement will require reporting in the 2025 update. Some will be pushed to the next base year. And the final bucket is forecasted targets, performance metrics, and expenditure. This last bucket is designed to be a little bit of a catch-all. We know that updates will need to be made that are not based on risk models, not based on lessons learned, and not based on areas for continued improvement. So this provides a process by which electrical corporations can propose any significant changes to forecasted targets, performance metrics, and expenditure for 2025, cannot go back and revise 2024 and 2023. In this case, energy safety defines a significant change to a change any greater than or equal to 10%. You've seen that number over and over again. We've tried to keep it consistent. And of course, each significant change requires justification. I will note that any non-significant changes to targets, sometimes we've heard from electrical corporations that through inspection programs or updating of asset management, that like the number of overhead circuit miles for a certain program might shift slightly because the measurement has changed. Those non-significant changes would be reflected in the electrical corporation's quarterly data submissions to energy safety and documented according to the requirements of the data guidelines. Okay, and that is all I had. Hopefully a lot of that made sense. If not, we can talk about it more during the discussion. Right now, we're going to take a quick 10-minute break. I have 9:58, I think. How about 10:10? We'll come back at 10:10 and we'll start our discussion. Oh, and as a reminder, for those of you who want to prepare remarks during the break, we are going to go proposed update by proposed update. So we will start with number 1, which is the risk modeling.
Hi, welcome back, everyone. I'm showing 10:10, and we can get onto the discussion portion of the workshop. Just to keep us all organized, just a quick reminder, if you're making comments, please identify yourself, and if you're representing an organization, please identify that organization as well. On Zoom, if you'd like, you can also click on the three-dot menu next to your name to rename yourself and add your organization after your name. I see a few people on the attendee list have already done that, perhaps from previous workshops. That is very helpful for us and for others to understand what who you're representing. Go ahead and flip forward to the next slide. If you do wish to make a comment, you can use the raise hand function in Zoom, and you'll be unmuted in the order of raised hands generally. And if you are dialing by phone, you can press #2 to raise your hand. You can also use Zoom's Q&A function to write in a comment. It is Q&A, but just to reiterate Lucy's points from earlier today, what we're really looking for today are comments generally on if you agree, what parts of the proposals you agree with, what parts you disagree with. Perhaps if you have alternative ideas, we'd be more than happy to hear those as well. And as Colin mentioned, we'll go through each of the proposals 1 through 4 in order. Try your best to keep your discussion or comments to the proposal that we're discussing. I do understand that there might be some comments that cross multiple proposals, but just in an effort to keep the discussion organized, let's try to stay on the proposal on hand. And with that, let's flip back to the slides on the first proposal regarding risk models and work plans. I'd like to see if any of the large utilities that we have with us, PG&E, SCE, or SDG&E, have any comments on this first proposal. Perhaps just to get some thoughts going, do you agree with the proposal? Maybe do you agree with the percentages, 10% of risk within the top 20%? Great, I see some hands up already. Let's start with Jay Leno. Rain, can you unmute Jay?
I think I'm unmuted. Good morning, can you hear me?
Yes.
Just have a couple of questions around the framework of the draft 2025 guidelines. State that non-significant changes in forecasted targets, performance metric, and expenditures are to be reflected in the utilities data submissions. Procedurally, when and how should the utilities make any updates in their quarterly data submissions for 2025 targets, metrics, or expenditures?
So, go ahead, Colin.
Well, we seem to have started with a question that doesn't relate to the risk models. Jay, do you mind hanging on until we get to the section on the performance metrics and the data submissions?
Yep, sorry, my apologies. So I did.
No, that's all right. It's just I think my brain was focused on risk models, and then you threw a curveball by asking about that. So if we could tackle that one a bit later, I'd really appreciate it.
Yeah, Lucy, sorry about that. I do have one around risk models. My apologies. My questions were a little out of order. So section 2A of the proposals for the 2025 WP guidelines include page limitations for proposed changes to risk models. There are no page limitations for other updated sections like lessons learned or progress on areas for continuous improvement. Is there a specific reason for the page limitations on discussions of risk?
Who wants to take this one? I think, maybe I can start, and then Colin and Nathan can add if they have anything extra. I think this is, the page limit was introduced because we just know how much information can be submitted when it comes to things like risk models, and we wanted to be clear about what our expectations were and the level of detail that we were looking for. So we felt that putting a 15-page limit, or at least starting with that in our initial proposal, would help manage expectations for the utilities in terms of what they should be reporting on and the kind of level of detail. And also on our side, in terms of, I mentioned right at the beginning of this workshop, trying to make a clear distinction between the base plan and an update plan in terms of the level of information, both the quantity and the depth of that, the sort of level of detail that's submitted by the utility. So it was to help with on that side of things. And you're right, we haven't introduced page limits for the others, and perhaps that's something we do need to think about, but I think we felt that it was most pertinent for this particular proposal, because we know just how much the utilities can write on this, because it is such a kind of technical and detailed and fast-moving topic area.
One thing I wanted to add is, if you don't have to provide the answer now, perhaps in your written comments, but rather if the 15 pages you feel is sufficient to cover the amount of changes outlined in this proposal, if you think it's not possible to cover the significant changes in 15 pages, please let us know. We'd be glad to hear that.
Thank you.
And Jay, you didn't say who you were representing. Would you mind just adding that so we've got it for the record?
I absolutely will. I'm representing PG&E.
Thank you, Jay. Let's go to John Rankin with SCE.
Hey, good morning. Trust you guys can hear me okay? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear
Okay,
you.
great, thanks. Yeah, so thanks for the opportunity to provide comments, and thank you guys for providing the materials a few weeks ago, because that helped us take a look and sort of start thinking about it in advance. So one question we're trying to understand with kind of the baseline or the reference point on how to determine if a risk change is significant. There's a table from the 2023 W&P that was in chapter 6. I think it was table 6-5. We kind of refer to it as the top risk circuit list. So our interpretation is that specific table would essentially be the reference point to which, if we were to make a change in our risk modeling and to rerun that table showing mitigations as of January of 2023, which was the same point in time that that table represented when it was submitted in the current W&P, that would be the reference to see if that top 20% population changes by more than 20%. So let me pause there. Is that correct? Are we thinking about that in the right way, or is that off base?
From what I understood, and I think I understood your comment correctly, that yes, you are correct. If I'll say one little caveat, that if I remember correctly, that specific table in the guidelines, I thought it represented less than the top 20% of risk, but the idea of having that like risk ranking of like 1 to however many in the top 20% it is the same idea.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, and that one was the top 5%. So of course it didn't cover all of them, but and it's, to your point, kind of a second clarifying question. It's not so much if there's movement within those circuits that show up in the top 20% when you rank them from largest share to bottom. It's more about movement in and out of that population. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. So that covers that. I had a separate comment if you want, or if you guys want to call on someone else, we can just come back.
No, go ahead with your next comment.
Yeah, so you had asked for feedback on the threshold value, the 10%. So SCE still evaluating potential changes in terms of both, does it make sense to move forward those changes and what would the impact be? So we're not really sure at this point, is the honest answer. We do have a bit of a sort of intuition on it that it might be a relatively low threshold. Again, we're not totally sure, but just sharing that informal feedback that it might catch changes that aren't especially significant or strategic. So again, just based on very rough sort of internal thinking, but just sharing that as some early feedback.
Great, thank you. Next, we have Katie from SDG&E.
Hey there, this is Robert from SDG&E. I came a little bit late to the meeting, but I heard there was a slide that kind of detailed the
Significant changes
significant changes.
in top 20.
Can you go back to that slide, please?
I think the slide up right now details the significant changes related to the risk model, which is the first out of the 4 proposals.
Okay, well, in that case, can you explain, so if there is a significant change in, it's like John was mentioning in table 6.5 and the 3 or 4 different metrics that we have in there. If there's a 10% shift on any one of those fields or multiple fields, we explain why those changes exist. And that's my interpretation. And then between, say, like segment rank, if there's a difference between, like, say, some segments are now 20% or 10% different from their rank, what they were in 2023 WMP, is that also reportable?
So the proposal right now is for not just a 10% change of the risk, but rather if 10% of the risk moves into or out of the top 20%. So if something moves from, say, the top 18% to the top 5%, that is not a significant change. But if something moves from, say, the top 18% and drops into the 25th percent, that would be a change, a significant change.
Thank you, that explains a lot.
And as a clarification, it is, I know we ask for a lot of different risk metrics or risk types, but we're only, in this instance, we're only proposing ignition risk and PSPS risk, which is those top that feed into the overall utility risk. Because I know there's like wildfire consequence and, oh gosh, there's all sorts of things like spread, and I don't remember, there's there's a lot of different types of risk, but for now we're only talking about these highest levels, ignition risk and PSPS risk.
Nathan, there's 2 questions in the chat in the question and answers from Gary Chen from Edison. Gary, did you want to ask these questions?
Before we move to Gary's questions, Robert, would you mind stating your last name for the record?
It's Robert Flammenbaum.
Thank you.
Gary, are you able to speak? You've been taken off mute. Okay, perhaps I'll read it out. Did I understand correctly that you wanted separate changes in risk rankings due to risk models versus mitigations? If so, what would you use as the baseline? And then secondly, regarding the 10% significant change threshold, is that numerical or risk weighted?
So if I understand the first question correctly, any changes in the risk from implemented mitigations would not count towards reportable count as significant changes. It is just changes resulting from some shift in the risk modeling.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, that's my understanding too.
And the second question, the baseline would be the model used for the 2023 to 2025 WMP update. Or I'm sorry, just base WMP.
Exactly.
The one you submitted this year.
So the updates are updates to the base plan. So the baseline is the base plan, and then what you're setting out is any changes from your submission this year to your submission next year.
Gary, please feel free to let us know if that was an incorrect understanding of your questions, or raise your hand if there's any clarification that we can make. Oh, I see, Gary, you're able to unmute if you have any follow-up. Okay, maybe let's move to Zoe Harold. I see your hand raised. Zoe, it looks like you're muted. You can unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thanks. Zoe here, Green Power Institute. So a couple thoughts here. One is, I think we are anticipating seeing completely new risk models. For example, PG&E is working on their egress risk model, which is really different from SCE's egress risk model. And so I don't know what that model will do in terms of changing, risk rankings overall in the top 20%, or how they're going to decide to apply it. So I do query kind of whether this significant, non-significant classification might result in really truncated descriptions of new models, and potentially the downfall of that being that if we want to review these new models in kind of detail, so that then recommendations can be made regarding whether other utilities adopt them, or if they're important to overall risk assessment, those 3 pages might be somewhat limiting for that purpose. My other thought with that is updating Appendix B. So right now, it looks like Appendix B, the technical documentation appendix, is not included in the significant, non-significant, and any changes made to these models, whether they classify as significant or non-significant, should be captured in that Appendix B technical documentation in a version update. So that might be something to add here. My third thought is, what if the application of a model is changed versus the design of a risk model? And the idea here being maybe SCE's like probability of ignition model is a good example. So they've shifted to not using it to quantify risk that they're using for determining where undergrounding goes, but the probability of ignition model is now binned into 5 bins, and it's used to inform inspection cycles. And so that's a change where that risk model hasn't necessarily changed, but the way that it's being applied to inform mitigation initiatives has changed. And under this definition, we wouldn't necessarily capture that change, although it may be captured, down the road in some of these other proposed changes to mitigation initiatives. So just a couple thoughts there, kind of in terms of updating some other complementary things so that Appendix B, maybe new models might warrant more discussion, even if they're not having really large impacts on risk, and then also changes in application of the risk models.
Helpful comments. Thank you, Zoe. We'll take that into account. One thing I did want to just remind you, obviously, there'll be the WMP update submission, but then the data request process will be the same. So if there's something that wasn't clear in the WMP update where you want to find out more information, both on your side and on ours as well, of course, there's always the opportunity to submit a data request, and that will remain. I just wanted to mention that, but thanks very, very much for your comments. Very helpful.
Thanks, Zoe. I see there's a couple questions in the Q&A, one from Henry Burton. Additionally, hypothetically, is it possible for a utility to make fundamental changes in modeling methods and data sources and yet find that the model outputs do not generally change the risk ranking of circuits in the top 20% of the system risk? That would be a very important change for stakeholders to understand, even if the model outputs are similar. I think this is actually quite similar to Zoe's comments in that there may be changes to the models that don't result in some change in the output. And we do appreciate that thought.
Henry had two other questions that I answered as well, just so that you know, and that I said we'd take them into account. So one was on the 15 page limit for the risk model reporting, and the definition of significant. So there's two further changes there that we should capture. Anything in addition you'd like to say, Henry, on top of the questions you've written in the chat or in the Q&A?
Henry, would you mind clarifying either if you're able to unmute or in the chat the organization you're with when you get a chance?
Hi, everyone. I'm with Cal Advocates, and I would like to actually elaborate, but I'm currently juggling between two meetings, so I will have to come back in a few minutes.
Okay, thanks, Henry. We also have we have a question from Jay from PG&E in the chat. Let me read it out. If we update our risk models but do not plan to implement the updated risk models for work plan prioritization purposes until outside the base WMP planning years, i.e. beyond 2025, is energy safety looking for that to be updated in the 2025 WMP update, or should this update be reserved for the 2026 WMP submission? So thanks, Jay. That's a helpful question. We hadn't thought of that. I think, from my perspective, having had just a minute to consider the question, I would say that we probably want to hear about that in future years, not in the 2025 WMP update, because it should be about changes that impact the year 2025 and the wildfire mitigation plan that's going to be executed then. Nathan and Colin, anything further you'd like to add?
I would say that potentially, I know we talked, going back to the previous workshop that we all just were on, we talked a lot about the difference between planning risk models and operational risk models. And I think Jay is talking here about the planning models, the future of risk prioritization or risk-based mitigation prioritization. I think we might want to hear about those changes to the risk model, but perhaps they could be like bucketed in that like non-significant, so you can like outline what changes are being made for the future prioritizations. But I agree with Lucy, that is something we would have to give some thought to.
Looks like Henry's provided a little bit more context. He said, I would suggest the following types of risk model changes are significant and should be described in any WMP update. 1, changes to modeling methodology or assumptions. 2, changes to data sources, such as using a new source of data to measure fuel moisture content and vegetation greenness. 3, adding new types of data. 4, changes in model application or use case. And 5, provide the complete model outputs. Thank you for that follow-up, Henry. Looks like Gary.
Yeah, go on, Nathan. I was going to just mention Gary's.
Looks like, yeah, Gary also had a follow-up. Is it correct to assume, is it a correct assumption that we are using January 1, 2023 as the baseline? So not taking into account mitigations implemented in 2023, using January 1, 2023 as a snapshot in time. I think this is similar to the first question you had. The January 1, 2023 would be the baseline for the risk, but any mitigations that happen to take place in 2020 within 2023, or since the previous table that was provided, any mitigations that have been completed would not be considered a significant change since that January 1, 2023 baseline. I'm not sure if that answers your question, Gary, or if maybe I'm misunderstanding what you're asking. I don't know if Colin, Lucy have a different reading of this question.
I think you are correct, Nathan. And I think the very simple answer is yes, do not take into account mitigations implemented in 2023 using January 1 as a snapshot in time. I think I'll admit, probably to Nathan's point, that I think SCE may have used January 1st, but PG&E may have used like January 23rd, 2023 in the creation of those tables in their WMP. So perhaps we can consider that as well, whether we want a truly defined date as a snapshot in time, or whether it is based on your 2023 to 2025 submission.
See, Katie from SDG&E has her hand raised.
Hi, this is Robert Flammenbaum again. Just thinking about the top 20%, that's about 100 to 150 segments that we would have to report on. I would suggest limiting that significantly. Similar to what John was mentioning in table 6.5 of the WMP, the top 5%. I think if you see the changes from the top 5%, and we could write good detail on that, it might be more impactful and more informative for you guys. Just as a suggestion. Thanks.
Great, thank you. The next question in the written Q&A is from Landy. Have we covered the change in risk score after the mitigation is implemented, and how to handle this before and after mitigation? For example, the undergrounding workshop for top 1 segment is completed in 2024. The risk score after mitigation will be near 0. How would you expect to reflect such a change? This, again, I think is similar to Gary's question, where mitigations are not captured. Any change in the risk score from implemented mitigations would not be captured as a significant change. These changes really are focused around any changes to the risk modeling and whether those shifts in the risk resulting from changes in the risk modeling, not from the result of implementing mitigations.
I'll say, for the record, I believe Landy is with San Diego.
And looks like Zoe also had a comment if page limits are used, it may be prudent to specify pages of text and allow additional pages of tables and figures. That's a good point. I think sometimes in the past we've had an exception for any supporting documentations besides the narrative. But Zoe, same perhaps question to you for the written comments that I think I gave to SE. If you have any thoughts on is that would be sufficient to capture these significant changes and the non-significant changes, we'd be happy to hear that. I'll give it a few moments for any last comments on the proposal regarding changes in the risk resulting from risk modeling before we move on to number 2.
And Nathan, let me just add, I can't remember if I mentioned this at the beginning, but there is the opportunity to submit written comments on these initial proposals, and the deadline for that is August the 18th. So that's still a month away. So that's hopefully helpful for capturing anything that you don't manage to provide in this workshop. There's another opportunity for written comments.
Yes, thank you, Lucy. And hopefully everyone has some time to digest the information and provide us with some good thoughts. And kind of with that, I'll also take a moment at the end of today to circle back to if anyone has any lingering thoughts on any of the proposals that they weren't able to get to in the moment. So let's move on to the second proposal, shifts in strategic direction from lessons learned. This is the one that has any significant changes in strategic direction, including a 10% change in targets. So perhaps same prompts, is this 10%? Do you agree with that? Do you disagree? Are there any other proposals that you think that we should consider here?
I briefly wanted to say for this one in relation to Zoe's comment about how the electoral corporations use their risk models. I know it is not one of the definitions in here where it could slot in, but I do feel that it might fit the spirit of a lessons learned. We learned that we can use a risk model this way instead of this way. And that could be a reflected change based on a key lessons learned.
Let's go to John Rankin with SCE.
Hi, thanks. And Colin, well, I'll just apologize in advance of this. I'm kind of restating what you said because I lost the audio for just a moment there. I guess one observation we had on this is, and I don't have a specific example for you, this is more just hypothetically. I mean, we may have strategic changes that aren't directly linked to a lesson learned. And so we just wanted to suggest that, a change might develop more organically or just through observations, as we are a few years into the overall wildfire mitigation effort. So we just wanted to suggest that perhaps that not be totally fixed, and there's flexibility to describe a change that isn't linked to a sort of more formally defined lesson learned.
Thanks, John. Can you give, because we've been trying to think through this, and obviously it's about striking a fine balance between between the amount of information that we get from utilities year on year. I want to sort of be clear about making that distinction between a base plan and an update plan, and really trying to focus in on, okay, what exactly do we need to understand in an update plan versus a base plan? So if you may not be able to provide any examples right now, which is fine, but potentially in any sort of written comments, if you could identify where those changes that might come from, if they don't come from the risk model, they don't come from lessons learned, it'd be helpful for us to understand that.
Yeah, that we hear you on that, and if we bring this up in the written comments, we'll try to think through some examples, even if hypothetical, to provide a little bit more specificity on how you might have a change that's not directly linked to a specific lesson learned.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Next, I see Sean from SDG&E.
Hi, just want to check you can hear me all right?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great, thanks. One thing I wanted to comment on here was around the definition of significant of greater than or equal to 10%. I think 10% is, for SDG&E, we do generally consider changes greater than or equal to 10% significant for some of our large volume work. But similar to the way some of the initiatives are grouped for the independent evaluator review, where there's kind of large volume and small volume, 10% may not become a very significant shift for some of the low volume work. Similarly, same for expenditures, right? 10% of $10 million may be very significant, but 10% of say, $50,000 may not be considered significant. So one thing I was thinking of proposing would be something along the lines of different percentages for that large volume versus small volume type of work. So while 10% would be good for large volume work, maybe something like 20 or 25% for small volume work, and a similar type of threshold for the expenditures. There was also separately, maybe for the expenditure change, something similar to the change order guidance, where there's 10% and some amount of money, say 10% and $5 million or 10% and $1 million, again, to avoid that reporting things that were quote unquote significant that may just be 1 or 2 units or a few $1,000s that might not be significant for some of the lower value or lower volume type work.
Great, thank you. That's very helpful.
I did have one other minor thing to touch on here, if it's okay. Well, if you can still hear me.
Yes, go ahead.
Sure. Again, one other thing was around each of the updates being tied to a key lesson learned. I do think, especially if you're very close to some of those shifts, it may not be tied, specifically to a lesson learned. It could be, something that happens a little more organically, meaning maybe we slightly under or overperform in the current year, and therefore shift our target next year up or down by 10% to compensate for just general accomplishments. I'm not sure if that would tie specifically to a lesson learned, right? But it would qualify as significant. So just wondering if there's some maybe some additional thought around everything always being tied to a quote unquote key lesson learned, as I can think of some examples where that may not always be the case.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that comment, Sean. I think that echoes SCE sentiment, and we'd be happy to hear those specific examples in either now or in written comments, so that we can consider whether lessons learned does capture what we're looking for in an update. That also does look like it mirrors kind of what Zoe has a question or a comment in the Q&A, and looks kind of along the same vein. The WMP lessons learned do not often seem to capture a lot of the changes made and why. I think this touches on what John suggested, but agree that expanding or altering this definition beyond lessons learned may be necessary to capture, quote, significant changes. So thank you, Sean. Thank you, Zoe. I'll give it a few more moments to see if anybody has any comments on the changes from lessons learned, changes, these 10% changes to targets or expenditure. We also have the changes to a compliance year. And I see John has a Q&A question. Perhaps we can touch on that after we go through each of the proposals that's related to the process. Oh, Sean, I see your hand up. I don't know if it's still up from earlier or if you have a new or different comment. Go ahead and speak up.
No, I think my comment might be a little early. I was going to talk more about some of the forecasted targets, performance metrics, and expenditures, not just the shift in strategic direction, which I think comes after the ACI area.
Yeah, I think that's number 4. So
yeah, I can hold it. Yeah, my apologies.
Thank you. No problem. Let's move to number 3, progress on areas for continued improvement. I think to me, this one's quite straightforward. It's on areas for continued improvement that are issued in energy safety's decision. Are there any comments on this one? Any feedback on if you agree, if you disagree, or any alternatives? Zoe, I see your hand up.
Thanks. So nothing, specifically about changing this one, just kind of wondering if we have ACIs that are, for example, addressing detail provided in modeling, risk modeling, application of risk models, there may be some overlap there. And so whether, or maybe specifying in here whether or not utilities can reference their, updated like section A for about their risk modeling in their ACI, or if they need to specifically answer the ACI. So if there's any overlapping information between section A and B, and now I guess this is C, specifying how utilities should manage that overlapping information.
That's a good point, Zoe. Thank you. Just curious for you as somebody who looks at the WMPs as well, what would be most helpful for you? Do you think having the utilities specifically respond to each ACI is more helpful, or do you find that as repetitive to something that was in another section?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'll have to think about it a bit. We did look at the ACI sum, and then they would refer to separate sections in the WMPs, and then you'd go to the WMP and it might not really provide specific answers to the ACI. So I think there's some challenges there with very specific prompts and ACIs that are maybe not getting captured in like the open-ended prompts for the WMP. So yeah, I'll have to think about it a bit more, whether or not it's, prudent to have comprehensive responses to ACIs and then maybe a reference in section A to an ACI response about a risk modeling component or something like that, or vice versa. Yeah, sorry, I don't have a better concrete answer. It's not easy streamlining information in these complex outlines.
Right. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot. I was just
No, you're
had
good.
the opportunity to ask someone who also reads through the WMPs from the reader side. So if you have any thoughts that you feel like adding to your written comments, we'd appreciate
Sure.
those too.
For sure. Thanks, Nathan.
Okay, I think we can move on to number 4, which is the targets, performance metrics, and expenditures. I know we had a couple questions on hold from, I think, both SCE and SDG&E on this, but I think up on the screen we have the significant changes forecasted to targets and performance metrics and expenditures for 2025. These are, again, that 10% change. Let us know if you agree with this 10%, disagree with 10%, or have any alternatives. Looks like John Rankin from SCE.
Thanks, Nathan. So this is, I guess, kind of process question, not so much a comment on the 10%. So, we'd be submitting the 2025 update in, I think you said March or April of 2024. That will include program targets for all the different initiatives for the calendar year 2025. And so that is a little bit early in terms of our planning process to set things like, cover conductor targets or undergrounding targets, or, how many widgets a certain program might be targeting. Obviously we provided forecasts for those for that year 2025 in the base WMP. But I guess getting to the question, what would be the means or the vehicle if later in 2024 we see that we think a target needs to change? Would we have an opportunity, or what would be the process to do an update of that later on in 2024?
So kind of, I think later in 2024 for a 2025 plan, I think it would depend a little bit on the specific time. We, of course, the change order process would still be in effect if there is some reason to need to change the targets. I guess my question is, are you saying that you don't think SCE would be able to provide targets at that kind of April timeframe for the updates, and foresee needing to make perhaps large changes to those targets later on in the year?
Yeah, hopefully not large changes, but typically our planning and budgeting and goal setting process is at the end of the year and kind of the September, October, November timeframe. So, this would be, whether it's 900 miles of covered conductor or 850 or 950, making that type of commitment with a high level of confidence in the March, April timeframe is a lot earlier than we typically do in terms of the budgeting and operational planning process. So it would be that type of change as opposed to the changes that have been in scope for change orders in the past, which are more limited to, changes, more fundamental changes in the approach or risk reduction aspects of a program.
And just out of curiosity, is this something that you foresee as being a problem just for all future WMPs? Because we are getting to a point where we're trying to have the WMPs come in a year ahead. So we're reviewing the 2025 plan in 2024 with perhaps, we're expecting the 2025 plan to come in April, of the year before. So is this something that you would see as a challenge just moving forward beyond just the update at hand?
Yeah, I mean, I think we'd probably want to just think through it a little more thoroughly internally, and we can provide more detail and ideas in the written comments. But yeah, it is typically earlier than the planning process. And we're used to making forward-looking forecasts, in the cost recovery side of things. That of course takes place in the context of rate cases and CPUC submissions. In this context where there's a strong focus on meeting the goals, we just would need to sort of think through how could we set a target with high confidence that early in the year, I should say, that far ahead relative to when that target would actually be implemented. So it would possibly be an issue for us, and we might suggest some type of sort of light refresh or update, provided there's boundaries on that, and we can't just totally do a 180. But maybe if there was a means for kind of a refresh later in the calendar year or very early in the WMP year itself, that could be a way to address it.
Okay, great. Thank you, John. We'll definitely take that into consideration. Sean from SDG&E, I see your hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Nathan. So a couple comments here, just in general, agree with what John just laid out as far as the timing goes, providing some of these targets and whatnot in April of 24 without having the full knowledge of how 2024 goes. And for example, if we go over or under target on a specific initiative may lead to changes at the end of that year to the 2025 target. So just knowing that, and maybe thinking of how we can address those changes as we get closer to 2025. I know the change order process may still be there, and there's still some options in the regular QDR reporting, but just trying to firm that up of what would and would not be acceptable to place there. Secondly, these guidelines talk about significant changes to forecasted targets and performance metrics. I just also wanted to throw out there, it's possible we have significant changes to our 3 and 10-year objectives, possibly as those might progress throughout the year. So would consider whether or not those should be included in here as well. If those are some of our targets might be changing, it might also affect those objectives, and so would consider putting that in here as well. And then just in general, again, some of my comments from the previous area in number 2, where 10% may or may not be significant depending on the volume of the work. Again, so I would, if there are changes to the 10% thresholds, for maybe having separate thresholds for large volume and small volume, or large dollar and small dollar initiatives, if that could carry over into this area here. Additionally, right, as we still have the change order for significant changes, and they are defined a little differently between the change order and these update guidelines, which could cause some confusion. So I would, if it's possible, to align those 2 documents kind of as we move forward. Any alignment there, I think, would be helpful. And then just to reiterate, or ask the question, if there are non-significant changes to targets, performance metrics, etc., would the appropriate venue for those non-significant changes be just to include them in either table 11 or table 12 of the quarterly data reports? That's my understanding of it, but also wanted to just raise that for confirmation.
Yes, the non-significant changes would be reflected in the QDRs in accordance with the data guidelines.
Thank you. Yeah, that was all I have. I think I threw a couple things at you in there. Obviously, no need to respond to all of them right now, but I think that's all I have for this area.
Great. Thank you, Sean. Appreciate your comments. I see, John, you have your hand raised again.
Yeah, thank you, Nathan. Just two quick comments. We agree with what Sean mentioned on providing a means to update the 3 and 10-year objectives. Those are important. So it'd be helpful to know the right means to do that. And then the second thing, just briefly, we support the notion of getting to the year ahead schedule. Our challenge with setting those targets early is not provided to sort of suggest that we disagree with that kind of notion or plan or attempt to shift that schedule over also. That makes sense to us. We just we're hoping to have a means to work through that kind of timing challenge.
Great, thank you, John. I also see Jay has a written comment to the extent that a 2023 through 2024 change order request impacts targets for the 2025 WMP update. Is there a planned schedule for energy safety to provide feedback, approval, or denial of the 2023 through 2024 change order request? I think all of the details on the change order are in the change order guidelines. I'm not sure if your question is more related to if there's a change order this year that affects your submission for 2025, or rather if you're asking about changes that would be evaluated in the 2025 update and change orders related to that.
Jay, do you want to come off mute and explain your question? It's a little bit difficult for us to provide an answer.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right, perfect. Yeah, so just curious on the timing of, I know we submit our change orders on November 1st, I believe, according to the guidelines. Is there a date that we expect to have an answer back on our change order request? I'm just trying to figure out timing in terms of when we do our 2025 WP update. Will we hear in advance of our change order requests that we submit on November 1st? Is that helping make sense?
And so hypothetically, what would this change order request be relevant to your 2025 update, or would it be relevant to the 2023 2024?
Yeah, it would be updates to the 2024 targets and or objectives that potentially could have impacts on our 2025 targets based upon an approval or a denial of the 2024 change order request.
I see. Okay, that's quite a complicated question. Is it hypothetical? If it's something that you want to discuss with us offline, I'm happy to do that. It's a little bit difficult for us to answer on the spot. Obviously, we'd try and process a change order request as fast as we could, but if it was complex or we'd need to look into it further, then obviously that would take longer. We haven't set a timeline for energy safety to respond to change order requests for that very reason.
Got it. Yeah, it is definitely hypothetical, and we were just curious on the process. If this case, if we encounter that, but we can definitely set up some time with you if we do come across those later on this year.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I also see Sean has a comment in the Q&A. These changes all address the 2025 WMP update, but I would like to understand how changes to 2024 targets would be achieved. Would this be a change order request for significant changes and the QDR for non-significant changes? I believe any changes to the 2024 targets would be through a change order request. Those are being evaluated by energy safety in the current WMP evaluation and would need a change order to make changes to those.
Yeah, and I think that process is laid out in the WMP process and evaluation guidelines that was published either the end of last year or the beginning of this year, but that lays out the exceptions for the year 2024 because it is that transition year in that we're moving to a year ahead. So we have laid out some further information on that there. And perhaps I might try and find the exact page number for you and put it in the chat so you can see it.
Looks like we don't have any more hands raised or written comments at the moment. I think we can move quickly to the process. I know John indicated he had a question. Oh, I see. Zoe, you have your hand up. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thanks. I was just thinking a bit about this proposal also to have the redlined base WMPs and then clean updated WMPs. And it seems like that will necessarily capture a lot of small changes because presumably the utilities wouldn't want to submit a redlined base WMP that isn't capturing something like if they're using a different data set or if they've completely changed an assumption. And this is, just for example, risk modeling. So you wouldn't want to resubmit a base WMP that says we're using this data set, but you're not using that data set anymore. So I'm just wondering a little bit about the distinction between the update and the redline version, and maybe building in this redlined and updated base WMP is going to actually capture a lot of the things that maybe we're a little bit worried about aren't being captured by these summary updates. Just for the sake of not resubmitting incorrect base WMPs that no longer reflect what's being done. So it's just kind of a thought there that occurred to me and maybe something to think about when we're designing these updates.
Great, thank you, Zoe. I know John from SCE, you had a question about the red line version as well. If you can raise your hand and can unmute you.
Hi, yeah, thanks. And this relates to Zoe's question and comment. We're not totally sure of kind of the intention or how the red line of the base WMP would work. We understand the idea of the 25 update being a standalone document that's focused on changes. I think where we're getting a little confused is sort of what the red lines are and then kind of the extent of that. We're just sort of concerned about reopening that just in terms of, is that a slippery slope into really revisiting more of the base WMP than is intended? And then also, frankly, from an administrative perspective, it is extremely time consuming and challenging to do those red lines. The WMP, it's, kind of a final PDF that's derived from a lot of individual Word documents, and you can't really edit them as easily as you can with a more simple Word document. So we're just, I guess, mostly focused on the substance issue there of what is the intention of the red line, and just as a thought, is it possible to really make it where the 25 update is more of a self-sufficient thing that can describe what's new and as needed reference the original base WMP?
Yeah, thank you, John, for those comments. I think generally the red line shouldn't be capturing any changes that are outside of these proposed changes that we've put forth, that it's just a reflection of this number one document, the 2025 WMP update. I think what we were thinking is that we would like to see how, this is supposed to be an update to the base plan. So we would like to see how this update changes the base plan. And that's what we're looking for in the red line. We're not necessarily looking for any changes outside of these 4 proposed updates.
I also think of the red line and the resulting clean version as like a single source of truth. So like once the WMP update is approved, then this nice clean version of the 2023 to 2025, inclusive of any approved change orders and the 2025 update, exists for the records and additionally for eventual compliance reasons on our back end.
I see Jay has there's actually a couple questions in the Q&A. The first one from Lana with SDG&E. Is there a template for the 2025 update, or will there be one? Does it simply follow the 4 areas? There's not currently a template. We're still working on the update. This is kind of the first meeting to kick off this development process. So we'll look at that once the guidelines are starting to materialize. The next question is from Jay from PG&E. If we have extensive changes to an embedded table in the WMP, how should the update be treated? Is it acceptable to replace the table rather than have it redlined? I think those specifics will be developed in some equivalent of a process guideline. I think just off the top of my head, it feels like if you need to replace the full table, you could just strike out one table and put in a new one instead of having to have tiny, minute changes within the table. But we'll do some more thinking around that. And we'd love to hear any comments you have on producing a red line. We are sympathetic that it can be an administrative lift to produce a red line document. And the next one, also from Jay from PG&E, is if we have changes to the WMP attachments, how should updates be treated? Do we upload a new replacement file attachment, or do we need to redline the attachment? I think same answer, probably just replace them, but we'll think more about that. And those instructions would be in a process guideline equivalent. But if you have any comments on what you think makes sense from your side as the writer of the WMP, please include those in your comments. John from SCE, I see your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. And yeah, to your point, we'll provide this in the written comments. But I'm just, so like an example of this, if we were to make a change in a significant change in risk modeling, and then that would require the narrative in the 25 update. I guess my question is, you would want that narrative in the 25 update, and then you would want red lines in the relevant portions of the base WMP that are changed or need to be edited as a result. of that. Is that correct?
Right. So I think in your example, you're updating your risk model in the 2025 update. You would have, what that changes. Perhaps, it changes the 10% in the top 20%. You explain those changes, and then you would have the red line changes in the base, from the base plan, whatever that change in the narrative would be.
Okay. One idea could be to make those more of like a sort of a component within the 25 update. Just because with the base WMP, I mean, as soon as you have a red line that pushes things from one page into the next, that disrupts the entire multi-100-page document, and it gets pretty messy pretty quickly. So we'll think through this more and try to provide some constructive suggestions, but those types of things could make it a lot easier, really, for everyone, people preparing these changes and people reading them, to sort of see everything in one place without having to have basically two sets of things, right? The red line and then the standalone 25 update.
I'm sort of thinking out loud here as things happen, but it could be, we probably should consider that particularly updates to the risk model, and I'm specifically thinking about Appendix B, may not make sense in red line if the electrical corporations are using different versions of the risk model for 2023 and 2024 versus 2025. Like if it's basically an entirely, I don't want to say an entirely new risk model, but if it does have significant changes, we may want to see those side by side rather than redlined.
Yeah, we appreciate the openness to ideas on this. And again, we'll try to provide some examples to illustrate why we're concerned with the red line, and then also means that could help provide the spirit of that intention and with a different approach that could be more workable.
Great, thank you, John. Are there any other comments, written or verbal? I'll open it up to any of the proposals we spoke about today. So if you have any lingering thoughts or something that came to your mind after we closed one session or segment, please feel free to raise that now.
I'll just mention, I know we talked a little bit about the schedule, but that is also open for discussion.
John, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thanks. Yeah, so feedback on the pre-submission process. We did find that, frankly, to be pretty confusing. A lot of people internally within SE that struggled to sort of understand that, and people were confused on sort of feeling like there was two different versions. And those of us very close to the process understood, of course, that wasn't the case. But we did see a lot of confusion there. We'd suggest that perhaps we not do that pre-submission process, and that the utilities have the obligation to submit a complete WMP. I mean, we feel that that's really on us to understand the guidelines and submit a complete and thorough WMP. And sort of just from a process confusion point of view, and then it created some challenges in the evaluation from third parties, because some of them were looking at the pre-submission, some of them waited until the updated one was issued. It just felt a little confusing, and one of those things where it might be cleaner and easier just to go straight to the final version. And if we're deficient in an area, then that's on us, and we just have to take that responsibility.
Great, thanks for that feedback, John. I also see Jay from PG&E has a question on this pre-submission process. When would the pre-submission for the completeness check be due? We don't have a specific date yet, but I think this year it was approximately a month before the actual submission date. I imagine it would be somewhere around the same if we kept that process. Sean from SDG&E also has a comment that he agrees with John for 2025. SDG&E felt that the completeness check was useful for a brand new base year plan. The update should be significantly shorter without a lot of new information and metrics, and the completeness check may not be necessary for the annual update versus a new base plan. Jay from PG&E has another comment. Given that the WMP updates are not final until after the utilities respond to Energy Safety's completeness check, is it Energy Safety's intent to commence WMP discovery for stakeholders before the completeness check process has concluded? And we still have to think about this completeness check process for the updates, of course, but I would imagine if we stuck with a completeness check process, it would be similar to this year, where the discovery process did not start until the official submission. Henry Burton from Cal Advocates says, from Cal Advocates perspective, we appreciate OEIS's effort here to clearly differentiate a WMP update from a comprehensive 3-year WMP. In past years, the updates have looked a lot like entirely new WMP submissions. Having both the update submission and the red line version make it a lot easier to review the submission and hone in on the new information. Thank you for that feedback, Henry. I'll give it a few more moments to see if anybody has any last lingering thoughts or suggestions on anything we discussed today. John from SCE has a written comment that says, SCE also appreciates the effort to focus the 2025 updates on meaningful changes. Okay, with that, I'll close this open discussion portion and turn it back over to Lucy to go over next steps and closing out the meeting.
Thanks very much, Nathan, and thanks for all the questions and feedback, comments. We'll certainly be taking that all into account as we move forward. Next slide, please, Colin. So as a reminder, I did mention this earlier, but we are accepting written public comments. So in terms of these written comments, we would like them to focus on the proposals outlined in today's presentation. However, if you have additional proposals that you'd like to put forward, we'd be very interested in hearing all about them. If you disagree with an energy safety proposal, please specify which aspect of that proposal you disagree with and provide a clear alternative proposal if you can. So written comments shouldn't be longer than 25 pages, and supporting documents such as appendices or attachments are excluded from the 25-page limit. So as I mentioned earlier, written comments are due on August the 18th. That gives a full month. And must be filed to the docket, the 2023 to 2025 WMPs, and we've provided a naming convention here, which I won't read out, but you can see in the slide decks, and the slide deck will be posted to our to this docket after the workshop today. So I wanted to finish up with a tentative schedule. And again, this is something that you can provide comments on if you have any. So where we are today is July the 19th, which is a public workshop. As I mentioned, the written comments on the workshop are due on August the 18th. The next step then is to publish the draft guidelines at some point. Draft publication, yeah. So publish the draft guidelines in around November 2023, we think is achievable. We'll then have a workshop on these draft guidelines around probably 15 days after the publication of the draft guidelines. We'll be accepting comments on the draft around 30 days after the publication of the draft guidelines. And then we hope to have the final version wrapped up with the adoption meeting very early in 2024, hopefully in January. And then what we'd expect is that the WMP submissions for those utilities who are requesting a safety certification will be around April 2024. And then for all others, it will be June 2024. So that is the timeline that we're currently working on. So that is it from me and from Colin and Nathan. Thank you all again for your comments and feedback, and we'll very much look forward to reading your written comments on our draft initial proposals. Thank you very much for your time today.